I'm Drew Savage. We're changing things up a bit for this episode. Instead of going deep on a hit Christmas song, we're going deep on some hit Christmas movies that so many of us watch every year. The holiday movies of John Hughes. National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and of course, Home Alone. Ron Payne worked alongside Hughes as either music supervisor or post-production supervisor on those films, and he's our guest for this episode of Behind the Christmas Hits.
Behind the Christmas Hits with Drew Savage.
Ron, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you started working for John Hughes almost immediately after you got out to Hollywood. Before we get into some of the movies that we're going to discuss, tell us how you came to work for John Hughes.
So after I graduated college, I moved out to Los Angeles. I wanted to work in movies or music or something. Didn't quite know what, I just wanted to do it. So I just went out there and got a job running errands for an interior decorator. And luckily for me, she had a lot of celebrity clients. So, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, Albert Brooks. And her boyfriend was an executive at Universal. They had a friend who used to work with them who had just got a job with this new writer, director, got a deal at Universal. His name was John Hughes. And he'd hired a personal assistant, Jane. And they were looking for an office PA, a production assistant, the low-level person that runs the errands. So Jane was asking her friends who worked with me, like, do you know anybody? And they're like, oh, yeah, we know a guy. He just moved to town. So, went over. And at the same time, I had this interview with John. One of my boss's celebrity clients was Harold Ramis. And so I was running errands to his office, too. And so it was interesting. I had like an interview with John Hughes on Tuesday and an interview with Harold Ramis on Wednesday.
Oh, my gosh. And this is my entire childhood in 1 week's time.
I know. Well, let me say, huge SCTV fan I was all through college. So, I was familiar with Harold Ramis. Oh, my gosh, Harold Ramis. I didn't really know John Hughes. I had seen 16 Candles before I left Indiana. It had been released just as I was leaving Indiana. So I saw it then and loved it and thought, oh, my gosh, this guy out of nowhere just seems to understand who teenagers. He actually hires teenagers to play teenagers, not some 27-year-old. So I told myself, whoever makes me the offer, I'm taking it. So I met with John on Tuesday and I went home and then Jane called me and offered me and I said, absolutely yes. And I was thrilled to death. And then I had to call Harold Ramis's office and say, sorry, I'm not coming in tomorrow.
Wow. Well, I don't think you could have made a bad choice there. Either one of those would have worked out great. But we're thrilled that the offer from John Hughes came first, because now we can talk to you about the John Hughes holiday movies. There are 3 of them that we want to touch on here, but let's start with National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. As somebody who worked for John, and I think I read that production on Christmas Vacation started just 3 days after Uncle Buck wrapped. So as somebody who was working with and for John, at what point do you get involved with these individual movies? Do you know about them a year ahead of time, or are you just going from movie to movie to movie?
Right. Yeah. So John, amazing. I do not throw the word genius around lightly, but I would classify him as a genius. He had a gift, and he was so prolific, but he was smart, and he was always, worried that, this is my last movie. So he always had a plan to where I want to have one in production before one is released. So if it's a bomb, they can't fire me. So yes, to your point, he always had one in preparation, one in production, and one in post-production at the same time. Uncle Buck was shooting and they were prepping Christmas Vacation. So I remember we shot Uncle Buck in Chicago at an abandoned suburban high school, and he had an office in there. So in between setups directing Uncle Buck, he'd go back to his office and write, and I'd be in there with him. And he was rewriting Vacation while shooting Uncle Buck. Again, amazing. He would come in and say, I need a reason why they're going to something. And I'm like, oh, well, when I was a kid, we had these you-pick strawberry fields. He's like, yes, you pick. They pick their own tree. So he wrote that scene. Just the genius of the man was he was very collaborative at that stage. And you talk to any actor he worked with, and they would, I think, all describe him as very collaborative. So then he started riffing. Of course, with his advertising background, he wanted something kind of sing-songy and jingly for the road signs as you're getting closer to the thing. So he came up with, you pick, you pay, you saw, you save, you better watch the road. and then it was Jolly Jerry's Saw and Save Christmas Tree Ranch. That was that was his thing. And so that was in there. I don't think a lot of that either didn't get shot, or if it did get shot, it didn't make it to the final cut. Yeah. Even though he was a lot of writers are very precious about their words, and he wasn't. I can't tell you how many fantastically funny scenes were cut out of all of his movies, just because he was always focused on, the final product and what he wanted to say. And his throwaway stuff was 10 times funnier than most things you'd ever see anywhere else. And I was just like, oh my gosh, how can you cut? That's so funny. You can't cut that.
Anything come to mind for scenes that would have been cut from Christmas Vacation that we never saw, but you did?
The opening sequence where they go and cut down their own Christmas tree. I think it was Jolly Jerry's Christmas Tree Ranch. I think there was a sequence with Jolly Jerry. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there was an extended scene there with Jolly Jerry.
That could have been fun. In fact, that feels like Jolly Jerry. That could have been very much like the John Candy role from the first Vacation movie. Just could have turned out to be such a memorable cameo. But it sure sounds like you were a big fan of the Christmas Vacation concept right from the jump.
Oh yeah, no, it was great. Well, when he first hired me, one of my first tasks was, he started as a writer for National Lampoon, the magazine, and he had a collection of all the magazines that he had written for. So my job was to take all of the magazines and sit there at the photocopier for a day and make photocopies of all his articles. But he had written 2 short stories for the magazine, and I forget the titles exactly, but one was like Vacation 55 and then Vacation 58, or 2 years in the 50s when he would have been a teenager growing up. Fantastic short stories. So the original Vacation movie was based on the first short story, and then the Christmas one was based on the second short story. But after the success of the first Vacation movie, of course, the studio, once they had struck gold with the first Vacation, wanted another one. And so I think he did European Vacation.
Yeah, European Vacation was the second one, and then Christmas Vacation was the third in the series.
Yeah, he wasn't as involved with European Vacation. I think he did a first pass script, and then other people took it over and finished it.
Let's talk a little bit about the music of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. You were the music supervisor on that film, and this one didn't really have a ton of original songs on the soundtrack like so many John Hughes movies did. There is one, the opening theme to the movie, Christmas Vacation, which was sung by the legendary Mavis Staples. How did that collaboration come to be?
I think that came from the studio, Warner Brothers. The animated opening, I think, came later. I don't think it was in the original script. Later, it was like, oh, we've got a chance to do something there. So, as I recall, Warner Brothers brought in Man and Weil, and I'm very grateful that even though I was a relatively young age, I certainly knew who they were. I was a fan of rock and roll and history, and so I knew who they were. So yeah, when I met them, went to their offices, and I was like, ooh, these are 2 legendary figures. Yeah. And they were very, very nice.
Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, the songwriting team, they wrote You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' for the Righteous Brothers. They wrote You Gotta Get Out of This Place for the Animals. Somewhere Out There, Linda Ronstadt and James Ingram. Yeah, these are some heavy hitter songwriters.
Yes, they wrote the track. Mavis Staples had just been signed to Prince's label, which Prince was a Warner Brothers artist. Huge fan of the Staples singers. I mean, that stuff they did in the early 50s was just amazing. So, yeah.
There are 2 really great needle drops in this movie, which I think are great examples of songs perfectly matching the scene. One is for comedy, and the other is a very sentimental scene. The comedic scene is when Melikaliki Maka, the Bing Crosby song, plays as Clark is having his swimming pool fantasy. And the other sentimental moment is the Ray Charles song, That Spirit of Christmas, as it plays as Clark is trapped up in the attic watching these old home movies. Take us through the process of matching that perfect song with the right scene.
Yeah, we had John was the night owl. He loved to stay up all night. He would stay up all night writing. So our team was obviously John, and then Tarquin Gotch was the music supervisor, and who eventually migrated into be an executive producer for John. And then myself, who started from PA, went to music coordinator, then music supervisor, then post-production supervisor. And then Bill Brown, who came in as post-production supervisor. But yeah, so that John would take us all out to dinner, at a very nice dinner. And then we'd go back to his house, at 9 o'clock or so. And we'd have there'd be a the editors, you'd get ready for a preview. John always loved previewing his movies for audiences. So the editors, he'd work with the editors. They'd get a cut they felt was ready to present, get some feedback. Of course, you're weeks and months before a composer's come on. So you needed a temp dub because you couldn't just play a movie dry to an audience. So the four of us would go to John's home office. He'd take us out to dinner. We'd get back there about 9:00. And then from 9:00 until about 5 the next morning, we would put up the VHS tape and just roll through the movie. And of course, John's home office, whether it was in Los Angeles or in Chicago, he had, you think my recollection is something, you should have seen his. I mean, I was so envious of John because he'd take us out to dinner in Los Angeles and we'd walk across the street to the Tower Records, which at that time was the big, huge records. And he would walk out with armfuls, stacks of albums. And I was like, oh, I wish I could. But so he had this tremendous record collection. And then Tarquin or myself or Bill, Jane, whoever, we'd come in with a few things of our own. So we just sit there all night long, play the movie. Okay, well, here's this scene. Oh, well, we don't need a pop song. We just need some score. So we'd crank out the classical music CDs and find something. And we'd assemble these temporary songs. And then we'd finish, 5 in the morning. And then by 8 or 9 the next morning, that same morning, we'd have to be up and at the mixing stage. And we'd bring in the CDs and the albums, get them transferred, and then mix them into the movie. And then the preview would be that next night. And then you get feedback, and the stuff that worked well, you'd keep, and the stuff that didn't work well, scrap it and start over.
So do you want to take credit for Mele Kalikimaka, or is that somebody else on the team?
My recollection is, I think Jeremiah Chechik, the director, had been gathering cassettes of Christmas songs, and that came from him.
And for the Ray Charles song?
I know that Ray Charles song was released in 1985, only 4 years before Vacation was released. So it wasn't like some old chestnut. I think it was John Hughes' big Ray Charles
song. Of course.
He used Ray Charles in the Planes, Trains, and Automobiles soundtrack.
So that was a big set piece. So pretty sure John chose the Ray Charles mess around on the set because Candy's kind of singing along with it and he's playing the dashboard piano and the thumb saxophone, So that Ray Charles, that was one John chose. So he was obviously a Ray Charles fan. John was so good at the sentimental stuff. When you're playing those old home movies, I mean, the Clark in the first Vacation movie, that there's some sentimentality there about his love for family and vacations, but I think it really drives that whole message home, that sequence where he's watching the old. Because if I recall, when he pulls up one of the reels, it might say like Xmas 55 or 59, which I think would have been the title of his original short story. So there's that connection there.
Well, we referenced Planes, Trains, and Automobiles a moment ago, so let's use that as a segue into this next John Hughes film we're going to talk about. John Candy, one of my favorite performers of all time. I really think he should have been nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor or something in this movie. It's just such a heartbreaking, beautiful, but also hilarious performance at the same time. Ron, any memories, any stories of working with John Candy on this or other John Hughes movies that you can share?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, John Candy was in multiple films with John. They made a great pair. So yeah, I am right there with you. I loved John Candy. Huge SCTV fan in college. And then when I moved out there to get to meet John and then Catherine O'Hara from Home Alone, and I was such a goofy fan. But yeah, I had great memories of John Candy. He's the nicest man ever. It was during the Great Outdoors. They were shooting it up in Northern California. And I think John Candy was a little bored. So John Hughes bought him a drum kit because Candy played drums. And John asked Tarquin and I to drive the drum kit up to John Candy. So we drove up there and delivered the drum kit to him. And he had an electric guitar that he was noodling with. And I barely knew a few chords on electric guitar. So he sat at the drum kit and I picked up the guitar and we tried to do Wipeout. So a treasured memory is up in John Candy's cabin in Northern California. I'm trying to play the chords to Wipeout and he's drumming. Such a sweet, dear man. Some of my favorite memories are just in between shots, hanging out with the two Johns in their trailers, swapping stories. They were the two of the funniest people on the planet. And occasionally, if one of us could throw in a story that made them laugh. I had a story one time about getting locked out of my apartment and I had to crawl down the fire escape and it was some goofy thing. And they were both laughing. And I just thought, and inside I'm like, oh my gosh, John Candy and John Hughes are laughing It was just great. Yeah.
Let's quickly touch on the music of planes, trains, and automobiles. A lot of it is just synthesizer tracks in the background. What overall approach did John have with the music going into this movie?
Yeah, his original thought for planes and trains and automobiles was country and Western music. It's similar to Weird Science. His first thought and the first temp dub was all 1950s doo-wop music. And after the screening, he was like, no, that's not working. So he scrapped it. And so, yeah, after we had a lot of country and Western stuff in planes and trains, it just didn't fit entirely. So about half of it was scrapped. We still kept a lot of the country and Western stuff. So when we did the soundtrack album for Planes and Trains, if you ever look closely, one side is called Town, the other side is called Country. So the Town side had the Dave Edmunds, the Nick Lowe collaboration, and then on the country side had the Steve Earle, Stars of Heaven, and other things.
And was that just a rights issue as to why the Paul Young version of Every Time You Go Away couldn't be used in the movie? Because it was somebody else singing the song.
Oh, I don't know that it couldn't be used, because when John wanted something, they found the money for it. There were a couple other tracks that we overpaid for. I'm thinking of Sam Cooke and She's Having a Baby. Well, and then, getting the Beatles for Ferris Bueller, that wasn't cheap either. No, I think he had signed, when he had his Hughes Music group, he had started his own record label, which is, again, kind of unusual. I think it was Some Kind of Wonderful soundtrack was on Hughes Music and a couple others. With Hughes Music, he had signed an unsigned band in England called Blue Room. They had a track in Ferris Bueller. They had a track in Some Kind of Wonderful on their soundtrack album. And Linda Hall, the female vocalist from Blue Room, covers the Paul Young Every Time You Go Away.
Gotcha. Well, Ron, we can't wrap up this conversation about the holiday movies of John Hughes without talking about the biggest one of them all, Home Alone. And for the music in that movie, the score was written by John Williams, who is probably the greatest ever at making movie music. When you have a John Williams doing a score, do you give him notes? Do you give him feedback, or do you just let John Williams cook?
Yeah, you just let John Williams be John Williams. Home Alone was a real crunch time project because, golly, I don't remember the original release date that was planned. And we had, from pre-production on, it's like, okay, here's the release date, December, whatever. And when Fox realized what they had, it's like, holy cow. So they moved that up like a month early to November, early November. So we had to crunch. And I remember working 33 consecutive days, Saturdays and Sundays included, to get that movie out in the theaters in time. And then I remember a day on the Fox lot, we were mixing Home Alone on the Fox lot, and I would be at the mix. Then I would walk down the street to the sound recording studio where John Williams was recording the orchestra. And luckily I had my little home video camera then, so I got some home video of John conducting the orchestra and recording the score for Home Alone.
Wow.
No, I don't recall any instances of like looking at Home Alone. It's like, oh, gee, John Williams really missed that one. No. Or I was like, oh, I had something completely different in mind.
Yeah.
No, it's John Williams.
One other song from Home Alone to talk about is Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, which is the soundtrack to when Mac is staging that party so the wet bandits think that the house is fully occupied. Brenda Lee was on this podcast last year, our final episode of season 4, to help celebrate the 60th anniversary of that song. And she really gave Home Alone a lot of credit for introducing the song to a whole new audience.
Yeah, well, it's very generous of her to say that. My recollection is it was a Christmas standard my entire life. I was born in 1960, so yeah, everybody knew Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree. So I'm sure it maybe gave it a second life for some younger kids, maybe. But yeah, no, that song just clicked. That was a great sequence. It's hard because when you're working on something and you're looking at it literally inch by inch, foot by foot every day for months, you kind of lose your perspective on it. Frankly, you're so focused on this cue, this thing, this edit, this, that, this sound, whatever. You really lose the perspective. You're just wholly focused on the thing. So it wasn't until after we'd finished it and I was just exhausted, and it opened pretty quickly. So we did some press screenings, which are, it's not a real crowd. And then the weekend it opened, went with my girlfriend. We went out to Palm Springs and watched it with just a regular audience. And you could tell within the first 30 minutes, it's like, oh my gosh, this audience is going nuts. I mean, it was and by the end, obviously with the classic sequence of the physical comedy, and then the sentimental ending, it took me a little bit by surprise. I mean, John was never reviewed. He had favorable reviews, but a lot of people criticized his movies. And it wasn't until Home Alone I started thinking, holy cow, this is like Spielberg box office territory, which John was obviously always successful. His movies always made money for the studio. But Home Alone, I mean, that's, you're talking top 5 movies of all time at that time.
Home Alone was released in 1990, Home Alone 2, 1992. But then by 1997, John was largely done making movies. He stopped making movies at a pretty young age and died, sadly, at a very young age of 59 in 2009. Ron, as somebody who knew him well, who worked with him for a long time, had he not suffered that heart attack, do you think John would have eventually gotten back to making movies?
I don't. Wow. No. I think he did what he wanted to do, said what he wanted to say. As I look back on it now, in many ways, I think of his movies as like those 80s teenage movies as like $6 to $9 million mixtapes. I think in many ways he made the movies just to be like a mixtape. Because if you remember in the 80s, everybody made cassettes and then you'd make your own. Yeah, I made a lot of failed mixtapes trying to woo women. But anyway, yeah. So I think
different podcast.
Different podcast. I know that he never stopped writing. He was gifted and driven. I mean, he such a hard worker. He wrote constantly, and so I think in his later years, writing was not so much screenplays. It was plays or short stories, or I think he experimented with a lot of different things. But he was at heart. He was always a writer.
You worked on these movies. Do you rewatch them every year like so many of us do?
Well, they're kind of hard to miss. Home Alone and Christmas Vacation, Planes and Trains. And I don't stop and watch them all the time. I can go quite a while in between watching them, from front to beginning or beginning to end. I mean, no, I'm immensely proud of my minor contributions and the ability to work next to somebody and for somebody who was so talented and I think influential. And I think in the same way that, when we look back 500 years from now and you want to say, what's an example of rock and roll? It will be the Beatles, right? And I think if you're going to look for examples of like American teens in the 20th century, it'll be John's movies.
No argument here. Ron, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Christmas Hits and sharing some stories about these movies and the music in the movies that we love so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Savage. You can find me on Instagram at Drew Savage On Air. What's the John Hughes movie you rewatch every year? My wife and I are locked into Christmas Vacation, which is probably why I spend so much time on that movie in this episode. We haven't shown it to our kids yet, but they're 10 and 13 now, so this might be the year. If you enjoyed this conversation with Ron Payne, please consider leaving us a review and clicking subscribe so you never miss a story behind the Christmas hits.